Okay. Hi. I want to start by thanking the conference organizers for inviting me to this timely event. The title of this talk is A Right of Data, Crisis Narratives, and the Politics of Counting Under COVID. I'm going to try and bring together three strands of my recent work. The first about the transformative effect of network technology and how data is leaked, distributed, and exfiltrated, which is drawn from a chapter of my recent book, Hacker States. The second strand is from a recent article I wrote with collaborators in the Doctors Within Borders project on mobilities and health inequalities. And the final strand is for a new book that I'm working on about the criminal justice system's incapacity to respond to a series of emergent crises. All of this not necessarily in that order, and hopefully all of this will make sense together. So I want to start with a vignette about the UK government's response to the coronavirus. On March 11th, 2020, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, announced plans to increase daily testing capacity to 10,000. Yet a day later, the government reversed course and downplayed the efficacy of testing altogether, clarifying that it would now move to restrict testing availability. Less than 1 week later, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson increased the target again, claiming that daily testing capacity would soon reach 25,000. This was followed a day later by a pledge to deliver new antibody tests at scale in the coming days, a claim seemingly confirmed 8 days later with a report by Mr. Hancock again that 3.5 million antibody tests had just been purchased by the government. On March 25th, despite acknowledging that current testing capacity stood somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 daily tests, Boris Johnson announced that soon the UK would move to 250,000 tests per day. Yet by March 31st, the government was forced to admit that its ability to increase testing capacity was being hampered by a global shortage of chemical reagents for the test. So it was only on April 2nd that the testing units surpassed 10,000 people a day for the first time since the beginning of the crisis. At that same briefing, the health secretary also announced a new testing target of 100,000 tests per day by the end of the month. He also said the UK would buy 17.5 million antibody tests because the previous 3.5 million tests were not sufficiently reliable. Yet by April 17th, the government was still only carrying out some 18,000 tests per day, and on April 27, just days before the government's ambitious deadline, the number stood at a paltry 37,024. So it's not surprising that when on May 1st, Hancock announced the incredible achievement performed by the government of 122,347 tests in a 24-hour period, that the claim was met with significant skepticism. Apparently, the figure was inflated by 40,000 tests because dispatched home testing kits were counted in the tally for completed tests. At about the same time that Matt Hancock pledged to increase testing capacity to 10,000 per day, the UK government was also trying to replenish rapidly dwindling personal protective equipment supplies for National Health Service staff amidst a global shortage, as well as attempting to enlist domestic manufacturers in a ventilator challenge to build 30,000 ventilators that it believed would be needed in a matter of weeks. Thus, the above snapshot is but one of many such data timelines surrounding the procurement of personal protective equipment, the procurement of ventilators, or the rollout of contact tracing that might be assembled to map in numbers the UK government's mobilization in response to the COVID-19 crisis in those crucial 8 weeks in March and April. Everywhere we turn, it seems that we are daily inundated with a grim accounting of the pandemic's reach. The narrative that I just sketched out has appeared in far greater detail in most of the UK's major newspapers and other media outlets throughout the crisis. These narratives punctuate the daily official figures of tests conducted, number of people that have tested positive, and total number that have died from the disease, aggregating since March. As we saw from the vignette, this politics of counting is all the more remarkable because its target is continually shifting. Every week or so, we seize upon a new area of focus, whether this is the number of pieces of protective personal equipment delivered to nursing homes, or the number of tests carried out, or the number of hours it takes to return a test result. Recently, with the beginning of university and school terms, we are awash with numbers surrounding local infections and campus quarantines, the efficacy of testing and tracing systems in various locales, the specifics of local lockdowns, and so on. At the same time, other sorts of numbers, also building since the pandemic's inception and swelling precipitously as we approach a second wave, are more difficult to count. For example, the number of prisoners that have tested positive behind bars, the number of COVID deaths in ICE or home office detention centers, the number of criminal trials that have been deferred, or the number of people that have been evicted or driven into poverty. Indeed, for a number of months in the UK, the number of deaths or even infections in nursing homes, despite being focal points of infection vectors in the community, were not even a part of the official infected or death tally. How do we make sense of and navigate this riot of data, this overabundance of information that is at once empowering and debilitating? I think we can make two observations as a starting point. First, there's a sense of overflow, as Mimi Scheller described it in her depiction of News Now, whereby the data seem to overflow their medium, crossing media platforms, slipping formats, and materially flowing alongside us as we move about the world. There's almost too much data out there. It's overwhelming and it's everywhere. And this brings me to a second point, the kind of secondary sense of riot. Although from one point of view, this data overflow isn't new, daily updates and briefings from authority are what one would expect in a crisis. The way that this numerical accounting of the pandemic is transformed by network technology and its new media and data ecologies is novel. In some important ways, it feels like something has been appended. And this is because what we are talking about is not just numbers. Indeed, the numbers seem to be the shorthand through which we try to make sense of the sheer scale of information we must contend with. We are archiving the present daily, and it's an activity that, because of its temporal proximity and its claim to totality, presents itself as a kind of raw transparency. Raw data appears unassailable, genuine, and claims factual status. It's the perfect vector for rebuttal. For example, early in March, to silence critics of its slow and mistimed response, the UK government dumped on the public, the opposition, and the press an exhaustive compendium of advisory group meeting minutes, group computer models and databases, social psychological reports on messaging, and ministerial background papers and briefings on the pandemic on its website. It amassed this under the heading Scientific Evidence Supporting the Government Response to Coronavirus, as if it was an exhaustive and total inventory of the data used by the government to make decisions. What we have here is more than a riot of data. We have a riot of transparency. And I think if that is the case, then it makes sense to take a moment to think about how we got here in this brave new transparent era. So in what follows, I want to provide a selective history of what might be called transparency under network technology, drawing on my book, Hacker States. My aim is to sketch how this brief period, beginning in 2010, transformed the very data ecologies that mediate our understanding, assessment, and governance of this crisis. So, way back in 2010, transparency was seen as a universal salve, something that could mitigate escalating levels of distrust between publics and consumers on the one hand, and politicians and corporations on the other. You had techno gurus like Kevin Kelly opining about the shift from closure to openness as something evolutionary and predetermined. Legal scholars like Cass Sunstein praised transparency in government and argued that information releases inform public and consumer choices, increase official accountability, and help government work with citizens to achieve collective goals. As critical theorist Claire Burchell noted in commenting on this period, this way of discussing transparency builds trust, and opposes secrecy. It's closely related to public accountability and has been positively associated with democratic practice since the late 18th century. For much of the 20th century, it's been billed as a kind of pan-ideological good associated with American open government initiatives like the Federal Register, Federal Sunshine Laws, or the Freedom of Information Act. Yet Burchell also emphasizes its paradoxical and ideological aspects. Under neoliberalism, transparency facilitates global market transactions and helps secure the free flow of goods and capital. But this act of opening up government and corporations also significantly unbinds them. It shifts the burden of accountability on citizens who must now be vigilant about official wrongdoing and share the responsibility for their oversight. It is a move that diffuses official responsibility, even as it empowers publics to demand it of authority. In a way, transparency is in the contemporary period, functions both as a form of emancipation and a new form of control. The only way to break out of this paradox, according to Burchell, is to target or decenter transparency's claims to objectivity. By presenting itself as raw data, official transparency can position itself as non-interpretive or pre-interpretive, and thus is superior to gossip, scandal, conspiracy, or other narrative forms of account. And yet the latter become all the more important as tools with which to counter authorities' claims to totality. Indeed, Burchell and other commentators argued that publishing platforms like WikiLeaks presented a solution to the neoliberal dilemma precisely because of their hybridity. They routinely blended elements of gossip, scandal, and conspiracy with activism. So you had Julian Assange, who was motivated by a conspiracy theory of power and who presented radical transparency as a tool to interrupt the hegemony of conspiratorial nation states. In keeping with this, the organization's leaks often combined objective, transparent data elements with narrative interpretive elements designed to make their leaks stand out amongst a white noise of circulating raw content. Now, 2010 seems like a long time ago, but if we think back to that year, we might remember Chelsea Manning's leak of raw Apache helicopter video footage in Iraq, repackaged by WikiLeaks into a compelling collateral murder video. That video and the unprecedented size and quality of the leaks that followed, so think the Afghan leaks, the Afghan and Iraq war logs, the State Department cables, they seemingly ushered in a new era of radical transparency activism, which put WikiLeaks on the map and primed media ecologies and their publics for the Snowden revelations 3 years later. Manning's leaks set the template for the future publication of high-volume disclosures. For each leak, WikiLeaks or another broker organization like the International Consortium of Professional Journalists granted exclusive access to a limited number of news media outlets in different countries who collaborated on research and analysis, as well as generated relevant stories for their domestic markets. These activities were synced to a simultaneous international release date, a news dump, to maximize impact. In contrast to Manning's well-choreographed string of news dumps, Snowden's disclosures were a slow and steady trickle, which began on June 5th, 2013. Glenn Greenwald, then writing in The Guardian, detailed a top-secret court order requiring Verizon to provide the NSA with information on all telephone calls in its systems within the US and between the US and other countries. The next day, the first stories detailing the NSA's bulk domestic surveillance program, PRISM, were published in the Washington Post and The Guardian. Snowden's leaks were curated, and their dissemination was orchestrated over the course of multiple years. Unlike Manning's data dump, what remains striking today is Snowden's restraint and parsimony. After all, the published and publicly disclosed documents represent only a very small proportion of the full trove. The archive he shared with news outlets contained about 50,000 documents, of which approximately 7,300 have been released since 2013. And although there is debate about the total number of documents he downloaded from the NSA, conservative estimates put the figure at 1.5 million. At this point, I think it's really important to note how transformative network technology and the ubiquity of compact, high-volume storage equipment has transformed the reach and impact of data dumps, of acts of whistleblowing, and data reportage more generally. In other words, how these technologies have transformed how we think about transparency. There's no better example of this than Daniel Ellsberg's account of leaking the Pentagon Papers. Ellsberg wrote about how he smuggled the individual volumes of the top secret study, there were some 47 volumes in total, from his office safe at RAND to a nearby friend's ad agency where he ran the photocopier all night long for a year. Not only was copying the volumes time-consuming, it took him the better part of a year to make 3 not even fully complete copies, but he also had to identify secure physical places for their storage. He had to spend several thousands of dollars in reproducing the volumes. And once he had successfully copied the volumes, Ellsberg documents how he spent another 2 years trying to find an appropriate outlet. He went to the government, he tried to get it out in the Senate, he went to various newspapers, he even thought about self-publication, just trying to get the material to the public. So I think that's an important point. Network technology clearly fosters unique forms of temporal and spatial compression. If Ellsberg were to release the 7,000 printed pages that make up the Pentagon Papers today, let's say he released it as a PDF file, it would be no larger than 10 megabytes. It could easily, instantly, and anonymously be disseminated as an attachment to an email. Or it could be posted publicly via a public messaging board or mass distributed as a torrent. In contrast, if we were to print out Manning State Department cables, we would need 503 reams of paper and 40 hours at a rate of 100 pages per minute. Yet the complete archive of the Manning leaks, which are just short of 3 gigabytes, would fit on most USB flash drives. In fact, that's how he got it out of Iraq. This differential impact is also evident in a point made by Snowden in an exchange on these issues with Ellsberg in The Guardian. Quote, "The point between the period of Dan's activities and mine is the expansion of reach of a particular source who witnessed some wrongdoing. In Dan's case, what he had in his safe was the limitation of his reach. My reach was across a network rather than the confines of a safe. And what this ultimately results in is a dynamic where a particular employee can plausibly have more access at their fingertips than the director of an office or a unit or a group or an agency, or perhaps even the president." End quote. As Patrick McCurdy has pointed out, leaks in the digital age are, quote, "a function of the volume of data available and the ease with which it can be spread around and shared," end quote. But leaks in data dumps are also the inevitable underside of what I call the hacking state, a dynamic and interwoven assemblage of humans, non-humans, material infrastructures, and bureaucratic bodies, which generates, collects, stores, and makes instantly available an unprecedented amount of data. Ellsberg was one of only 3 individuals at RAND with physical access and clearance to the Pentagon Papers. In contrast, Manning, who after all was a junior intelligence officer, enjoyed a wide-ranging access across a vast network of databases and data exchange points, a level of access shared by an estimated 500,000 to 600,000 military and diplomatic personnel. The existence of these vast data repositories fueled the politics of suspicion and of conspiracy, but it also normalized their existence, their sometimes leak or exfiltration, and fed the ascendance of big data journalism and the transnational collaborative news partnerships that emerged to analyze and report on data breaches and dumps. So beginning in 2013 with the offshore leaks, 2014 with LuxLeaks, continuing with Swiss leaks and the Panama Papers in 2015, as well as the Paradise Papers in 2017, leaks and whistleblowing increasingly became central drivers of news reporting and coverage. The scale and size of these revelations is astounding, even when compared with Manning's mega leak of a half dozen years before. As I noted, the entirety of Manning's leaks was just under 3 gigabytes. Some of the releases, like Luxembourg leaks, were 4.4 gigabytes and comparable in size, but others far eclipsed anything ever seen. The Swiss leaks were over 100 gigabytes. The offshore leaks were 260 gigabytes. The Panama Papers were 2.6 terabytes, and the Paradise Papers were 1.4 terabytes. The breadth of these collections is equally formidable. The Panama Papers contained 11.5 million documents, emails, PDFs, photos, and databases, spanning more than 4 decades. The Paradise Papers involved 13.4 million files and spanned 6 decades. Equally impressive is the scale of the investigations. The Panama Papers involved over 400 journalists from a dozen news organizations working under the mantle of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalism. Similarly, the Paradise Papers involved 96 media organizations and a total of 381 journalists, again, working under the mantle of the ICIJ for 1 year, before once again synchronizing the publication of the first stories in a newsdom. So by the end of the decade, mainstream news organizations had increasingly incorporated reporting on leaks and soliciting such sources as a component of their professional identity and everyday work routine. Virtually every major newspaper now has it prominently figured on its web page and mobile applications, instructions and multiple options for how to securely contact and provide data or material via encrypted technology. The advent of impressively large unstructured collections of data has also required the development of new collaborative practices as well as new technological solutions for analyzing heterogeneous data sets qualitatively. Like the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers, right? Those leaks are simply too large for single or even multiple news organizations to manage alone. But the end of the decade also brought the ethics of whistleblowing in data journalism to the fore. We are back at the paradox identified earlier in Burchell's discussion of transparency. What are the latent and unintended effects of releasing all of the raw data, and what might be done to mitigate some of their more undesirable outcomes? Some have consciously taken the stance that releasing all of the raw data is irresponsible. So for example, although the ICIJ curates a searchable database that integrates some of the documents from its copious leaks, it and its media collaborators are completely against releasing the raw data. The ICIJ director, Gerard Ryle, has taken an almost anti-doxing stance, arguing that although their reporting has exposed those public figures and politicians benefiting from the global tax evasion arrangements, they are against releasing the sensitive information of private individuals. And he's on the record quoted as saying, "We're not WikiLeaks. We're trying to show that journalism can be done responsibly," end quote. WikiLeaks, not surprisingly, was extremely critical of this approach on Twitter in 2016. Quote, hashtag Panama Papers. If you censor more than 99% of the documents, you are engaged in 1% journalism by definition, end quote. In other words, news organizations have also begun to crowd out and displace alternative publishers like WikiLeaks for leaked information. Not only do the more established media outlets have the circulation and digital footprint to ensure a certain measure of prominence and explication, they also provide ethical reassurance for would-be whistleblowers. And seen from 2010, the world of 2020 is a world of hard contrasts. Leaks and data dumps have become ubiquitous and are now mobilized in service of a wide range of official aims, political tactics, and disruptive strategies. Those early pioneers are also back in the news, even if in sometimes counterintuitive ways. For example, in March of last year, The Intercept, an online media platform founded in part to house Edward Snowden's archive and to continue mining it for stories, closed it. And this summer, President Trump confounded commentators by actively speculating on the possibility of a pardon for Snowden. In contrast, after years of self-imposed exile in London's Ecuadorian embassy, Julian Assange is now in prison, awaiting the outcome of an extradition hearing to see if he will be sent for trial to the US for attempting to hack into US government servers with the help of Manning. And Manning was recently released, just in March, from jail after being detained under contempt of court for a year for refusing to testify in a grand jury investigation of Julian Assange. So what I've been trying to sketch out in this all too brief account of the past decade is a shift from a period when official transparency and radical transparency activism were relatively distinct and held out differential pathways for data governance, public accountability, and data activism. I've tried to chart this to a shift in a world where many of these distinctions are now inevitably scrambled, and we are left adrift in a sea of data. A world where we have the tools to surveil our surveyors, but where we too often lack the platforms to hold them accountable. And I think this eclipse of narrative is all the more destabilizing because we are in the midst of a crisis, of a public health emergency. Timely, targeted, and up-to-date data in copious amounts is central to the successful navigation of crisis, but it is also central to the narrative of crisis. As cultural anthropologist Janet Reutemann argues, the invocation of the term crisis generates blind spots which regulate the official chronicle of emergencies. By designating an event or a moment of crisis, we mark it off as a historical turning point, a moment of truth that is pregnant with normative significance. In this sense, crisis narratives generate judgments over the validity of the institutions and the concepts they seek to describe and explain. They produce moral demands that call for a difference between past practices, the causes of the crisis, and a future set of affairs. But most importantly, I think they form the basis for a set of political judgments which make certain actions and practices visible and indeed inevitable, while marking others off as invisible and unthinkable. In this sense, any invocation of crisis will imply a normal situation from which we have deviated, and hence a search for the answer to the question, what went wrong? But it also simultaneously sort of blinds us to an alternative interpretation of events. And so, by way of conclusion, I'm just going to say that I think this is where the role and impact of numbers comes in, despite their riotous status. Official accounts of this crisis are predicated on crowding out alternative explanations through a deluge of data, like the scientific evidence supporting the government response to coronavirus, released by the UK government described earlier. This differential circulation of data does produce self-reinforcing blind spots, but it also generates new opportunities and new accountability platforms from which to call those political institutions and decision-making structures which led us into this crisis into question. Much of the data is there. I think what needs to be done now is to develop and sustain the counter-narratives and analytical frameworks that make alternative interpretations visible and possible. So thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. I hope you found it stimulating. And please feel free to get in touch via email with any questions or comments. So thanks again.